It's probably a bit embarrassing for me to go on and add an addendum about sort of speculating around finance and economics and economic systems, but I guess I'm going to do so anyway to at least sort of reveal my, I guess, my somewhat naive, perhaps, or ignorant sentiments and beliefs about, sort of things. But I, I mean, in some sense, perhaps the one revolutionary thing that might need to happen is essentially entrenching within the state some sort of safeguard that could help save the life of capitalism, or to help sort of bring some kind of stability or some kind of long-term sustainability. Because in some sense, in the same way that I think that it is democracy that has essentially consumed capitalism and destroyed it from its kind of moral, illiberal kind of I can't think of the word, but a kind of lackadaisical sort of apathy, and is that, that there perhaps should be something like although I don't know if this needs to be sort of enshrined within the constitution, but I think that a kind of, well, at least within the South African judicial framework and legal theory, it could be very easily, I think, a court case that people litigating on behalf of future generations, on behalf of the non-voting public in terms of the future generations, the citizen that is not yet born, to that they should not have to inherit essentially the repayment on debt and the kind of tax burden which they never got to enjoy the proceeds from, in terms of the irresponsible spending of an earlier generation. And so, in some sense, I think that there should generally be a bar against public debt. Uh, because in some sense, if debt is not socialized, is not owned, if the public, in terms of the governmental structure and institution, is not in debt, then it's much more capable, probably, of allowing businesses to fail and allowing proper, let's say, authentic capitalism to occur. You know, the government sort of, as soon as it has debt, is kind of probably becomes beholden in quite a toxic way to keeping the alcohol pouring at the party, as it were, in terms of the sort of the quantitative easing and the central banking kind of long-term irresponsible, kind of creating a phony economy. And so, I mean, look, I mean, I perhaps don't generally know enough about these things, but it seems to me that um, the government is not properly an independent actor. It's not properly objective in this kind of into tending to a liberal capitalism in which, sort of private entities are properly held accountable. That there's this kind of, as soon as you start mucking up capitalism with this kind of collective responsibility kind of stuff, and this kind of, then you can weave a kind of ideological narrative and an ideological magic to sort of create magical expectations and magical thinking and kind of ideological scapegoating, which essentially allows you to get into this kind of illiberal moral vacuum, which is what I think, which is how democracy has precipitated or permitted the consumption of capitalism, as it were. But essentially, that there should have been moral and principled grounds for the democracy to look at itself in the mirror and to sort of caution itself or to caveat itself, but that sort of never happens. And we're kind of dealing with the kind of the ideological hangover of this while we keep on being plied with essentially more alcohol. But what I'm basically trying to say is that the alcohol really that keeps the party flowing and keeps the madness continuing is something maybe morally proximate, talking about proximity to what's causing this moral dysfunction, is something like public debt. That if the government wasn't in debt, then perhaps we could have a much more serious political economy and a much more pragmatic political view of what's actually going on. But we can't even have that kind of genuine political debate because politics is so sort of invested into overspending or deficit spending, essentially. And essentially being able to rely on that kind of deficit spending without any kind of reconciliation or any kind of... I would even argue that if a government has not changed hands, in some sense, you can imagine that this could be integrated within the democracy. I mean, people say, oh, we should try and solve everything with the constitution. It's not entirely true. Hopefully, maybe a democracy itself could generate its own legislation to bind itself to this kind of stuff, where you could, and perhaps even legislation that requires a special majority in terms of the construction of that legislation, because it is in some sense designed to endorse constitutional rights of future generations. But essentially that maybe that what I'm proposing is that perhaps a bill should be passed saying that a government should not be able to indulge in deficit spending, especially if it is the same, if that political party that produced that government has remained in power sort of continuously, that essentially only when government changes hands should there be, if anything, a kind of some allowance for another round of deficit spending. That in some sense, the political party that indulges in deficit spending must at least sort of bring about an equilibrium before it goes indulging in yet further deficit spending, essentially. It's kind of what I'm sketching out. But obviously there are some cases that deficit spending for some things are certainly worth the investment. But, when that is sort of ungrounded in the political economy, when there's not proper transparency or proper sort of reason applied to that calculation, when it's just a kind of political rhetoric that is just basically hollow or a kind of superficial sort of thing, so how these things get, I do actually think that there is a general solution, that you could have something like a judiciary providing some kind of oversight into this stuff. Although obviously whenever you use the judiciary for oversight, you run the risk of essentially of then creating a political impetus to put political plants within the judiciary, which has essentially already happened. But in some sense, that's already happened because there is a general assault on the Constitution going on politically, and in some sense, they have planned it a long time ahead to try to sort of already loosen the the boundaries and the limits and the structures of accountability to the law and to the spirit of the law, but essentially, or the principle, the proper, like all of these things have sort of been, it does look like we're in some kind of general process of, generally speaking, degeneration and disintegration of standards and rules and principles and values. Sort of replace principles and values and rules with a kind of with a semantic ideological sort of game. And South Africa, in some sense, I think it is the kind of the canary in the coal mine of all of this, because we actually had a system that on paper, in theory, in principle, sort of has all the right checks and balances, has all the right standards and structures, but they've been sort of ideologically toyed with, and they've sort of been gaslighted, and we've had a kind of radical semantic reframing of things, with this kind of narrative witchcraft of, just calling things racist and calling things systemically racist, and as the general concealer and, sort of cover up of, sort of blatant corruption, and with the judiciary that should have been able to provide the resilience against this kind of abuse and bastardization of basic, reason and the rule of law and basic principles, fundamental constitutional protections and values, all of which have been bastardized and radically reinterpreted. But anyway, what's my point? Is that, I guess what I'm saying is that financially and economically, there's a parallel process to the argument around principles and morality in the law. Is that they, practically speaking, in terms of economics, there's a kind of, and politics, there's a kind of, where if you engineer a certain kind of problem, because in some sense, again, like the general solution to all of this is just an electorate that is properly informed and properly responsive. At the end of the day, you can't really blame the system for getting itself into a mess when essentially, maybe you can blame journalism to some degree to like not keeping the electorate properly informed and in some sense helping to promote a kind of democratic illiteracy, so keeping people diverted on, sort of other kinds of more emotionally compelling, sentimental, proto-fascist, political worldview kind of stuff, and, indulging in the outrage economy and the indulgence into hypocrisy and double standards. So, we suffer from a lot of this like endemic dishonesty. And one of the practical manifestations of this kind of dishonesty is something like, or is this perverse incentive which promulgates perhaps from public debt. So yeah, I do think that within the South African constitutional system, there is grounds to have a court case on behalf of future generations, and essentially saying, because, in some sense, you can almost imagine what the political response to this would be, which is that, oh, the situation is so bad, we have to obviously be allowed to do more deficit spending. And in some sense, the actual, sort of the paradox of that, which is that, well, perhaps more deficit spending on top of the already deficits that we have, the deficit in the fiscus, is essentially an accelerating sort of abysmal, kind of demise of the vitality of the entire system. And if they are sort of willing, if they're actually capable of, at least they should make the doubling down argument in front of a judge, where they should say, oh no, we've been so irresponsible and so bad at improving the situation that we should be allowed to gamble again. We should be able to, double or nothing on and go further still. And, in some sense, on the moral case, this has already happened in terms of non-racialism being radically redefined as this kind of racialist, identitarian, black economic empowerment, which destroys meritocracy and employs double standards, which completely distorts everything and creates a disgusting, perverse incentive towards racial consciousness. And because you have to look for justifications for the deployment of the double standards, and so you end up with this perverse incentive towards more and more divisive rationalization of what is essentially a never-ending kind of self-fueled, kind of proto-fascist movement. And oh man, this is a bit of a tangent, but I did just want to pick this up. I was watching the Daily Friend podcast, and they were talking about the double standards being applied against the DA in terms of how the DA was being criticized for not making an alliance with the ANC, and if the ANC goes off with the EFF, it's the DA's fault for not offering the ANC an alliance, not offering to have an alliance with the ANC in terms of the local election results around Johannesburg or something like that. And Gabriel Krause made the point that, well, why don't you say that about, why is it the DA's job to make an alliance with the ANC? Why don't people say that about Action SA? Action SA and the ANC could also make a majority. Like, why don't you make the same argument to them? Like, it's strange how there's always the DA, which then is cast as this racist and white party, that it's sort of, that, they sort of, everything that good that happens, or if anything bad happens, they get scapegoated for it. But it's interesting, and sort of, I think in the same Daily Cast podcast, they were talking about Herman Mashaba's strange radio sort of quote where he was saying that the DA is trying to make a deal with the ANC, and complaining that the DA doesn't care enough about poor black residents, and that they don't care enough about providing service delivery to poor black residents, and that they are treating people very badly in the Western Cape. And also saying that the DA needs to work with the EFF, essentially. And I mean, sort of the very strange things that Herman, I mean, like a lot of this racial politics, which you can see is and I want, okay, anyway, and I think that these things are exactly linked. The reason why these things might seem slightly disparate, but I think that in the same way that there's a double standard being applied to the DA, I think Herman Mashaba is responding to that double standard himself, in some sense. That's the only way that he can prove, in the current political climate, in the current zeitgeist, or whatever. I think Herman Mashaba is perhaps not being so illogical, but essentially that they are going to be accused of being just like the DA at the end of the day. They're going to fall into the same category in terms of how the DA is generally treated by the media. If Action SA doesn't sort of try to scapegoat the DA in the same way that everybody else tries to scapegoat the DA, and sort of externalize blame onto it in this, what Gabriel Krause correctly calls a very disrespectful way of framing things, and as this kind of weird white supremacy, kind of white savior sort of guilt complex as well, that everything rests on the shoulders of, and that there's no agency in these parties which are considered more black, like that the ANC is never responsible for its own failed policy, and the EFF is never responsible, and that it's always somebody else who should have hypothetically done something differently to change the outcome, and then they get sort of all the blame. I mean, this is a natural sort of double standard which comes from their general disgusting worldview, which is essentially dependent on scapegoating and externalizing blame and dissolving agency into a complaint about systemic oppression. And Herman Mashaba has definitely sort of cottoned on to that general formula. And I mean, I don't know how ideologically possessed he perhaps is, but I mean, he obviously he sees himself in terms of perhaps look, I mean, I can only speculate. It's either one of two cases. He either has to he's refining his political brand, and so he has to make these kinds of comments and essentially these kinds of systemic complaints and scapegoating the blame, because otherwise he's not going to be an identity politics candidate. He's not going to essentially get people who believe in identity politics to not vote for the EFF but instead vote for Action SA. So he's trying to steal the thunder of the EFF and be a kind of an ideological alternative to them, but not alternative in the sense of identity politics, only alternative in the sense of and essentially the only way to prove your credentials in terms of identity politics is to find a token of whiteness and white supremacy, and to call it that, to call it a representative of white supremacy and whiteness, and to vilify it and to blame everything onto it, and to create a kind of conspiracy theory around it, which is exactly what Herman Mashaba did with all of this. The DA is conspiring with the ANC to make an alliance or something like that in this local election, and that the DA is you make all these weird accusations. Anyway, the point that I wanted to make is just to sort of connect these stories together. That I'm perhaps not saying anything new. Sorry, there was an element that I'm forgetting to mention that made this parallel somewhat more poignant and relevant. But I kind of said this in one of my other earlier recordings, which is that, sort of these people, I think, are very conscious that they have to grab a pitchfork, because if they're not holding a pitchfork, then they're going to be sort of ideologically bucket fished. And so they have to kind of, they have to join the witch hunt, essentially. But sometimes I worry and I wonder that maybe, because it's one thing to cynically join a witch hunt, because you have to sort of be a part of the bandwagon in a hope of sort of redirecting where it's going, where it's veering off to. It's quite another thing to sort of actually believe that you're prosecuting a witch, and that you're actually part of generating the show trial, and you're part of, sort of confecting the evidence and things like that. And so, I don't know, Action SA to me seems like ideologically an incredibly volatile sort of entity. So much so that, they're showing signs of being just like the EFF, essentially. And if they're going to have the same kind of racial toxicity as the EFF, they might find themselves even more in the long term damaging to the DA in terms of actually, perhaps how the DA plans to arrange coalitions with contracts and things like that. Perhaps even if the coalition does fall apart, it won't. They won't be capable of essentially blaming the DA at the end of it. Although I imagine that based on this kind of level of toxicity and racial rhetoric, that the DA really does need to be able to criticize this kind of toxic racial politics. And if the DA is going to be in a straitjacket of not wishing to threaten its local election coalitions of local government, because essentially it can't rhetorically defend itself against the toxic racial politics of these other groups, that's going to be a huge sort of risk factor. And in some sense, maybe you can still have your cake and eat it. That on the national level, you can still have a local government coalition, and on the national level, you can essentially have an escalating ideological war of rhetoric and let's say vehement disagreement and between the parties, but that perhaps the local government election can withstand it. Although I can imagine that Mashaba is one of these people who, if he keeps on having his rhetoric countermanded or contradicted by what is essentially a coalition partner on the local government level, that he can threaten to sort of overturn the whole thing and go and make something with the EFF, or sort of try engineer a power sharing agreement with but I mean, yeah, I mean, Herben Mashaba sort of making these noises, which essentially are, I don't see any difference between this kind of toxic racial rhetoric and the EFF. I mean, this is exactly the sort of the accusations which the EFF are producing. But you can see, or you can imagine cynically why there's an impetus to do so. Because this is how you prove your credentials, because otherwise you get outplayed by these other racial politics people who say that you're not serious, that you're just a lackey of the DA or something. Because if you go into coalition with the DA and you don't say bad things about them, while other people are labeling them racists, then you've got essentially, so it really is, so I mean, commenting on this kind of level of politics is so really depressing, just looking at the quality of politics in South Africa, but essentially how people sort of are kowtowing this line, I guess. But if you're in the world of identity politics, I mean, there's just so much dishonesty and bad faith, and the dependence on double standards, that that this is the natural manifestation of it, in terms of externalization of blame and vilification and scapegoating, because it's such an unwieldy. It has so much sort of cognitive dissonance built into it that you need a pressure release valve, you need a scapegoat. And anyway, it is my general contention that the DA needs a better strategy of how to combat this kind of toxicity, and it needs to actually start confronting it in a controlled way, but in a direct way that it hasn't up till now openly declared war and tried to prosecute it, as it were. It's defended itself against this, and it's tried to make defensive moves, but it really needs to start being rhetorically on the offensive about these moral issues, and to actually do more against journalists, as it were, and to in some sense, having a naughty list of journalists that you won't, essentially, that when you're confronted with those journalists, it'll be brought up, and it'll be like, oh, you're the journalist that did X, Y, and Z. That is why we don't consider you to be a journalist. We consider you to be essentially a fascist muckraker. Like you are an ideological partisan. You're essentially a partisan of the EFF and the ANC, essentially, and just because you pretend to be impartial in the role, in the performative role of being a so-called journalist, that's not good enough. Like you're not a real journalist. Having some bearing of accountability, some mechanism of accountability, or some, and obviously when people are, well, I mean, you can still pretend to try to answer some of their questions, and when they keep on repeating the same question in a different form, you can just be like, well, you see, this is why we have problems dealing with journalists like you, or so-called journalists like you. Sort of demonstrating why these people are actually are morally defective, and how they are morally polluting in some sense, and reframing the debate and decontextualizing proper issues. and completely destroying proper issues through the diversionary lens of this toxic racial politics and accusations. And in some sense, the DA has to get into a point where it stops defending itself against accusations and it starts leveraging accusations of immorality against the people who have concocted this, sort of toxic market of propaganda for their racial consciousness. And when you start actually subverting this narrative, then it is going to get nasty, because the people who grift on this narrative and who completely depend on it are going to try to create a flashpoint. They're going to try to create they're going to create some kind of threat. And at that point, you have to make the very intelligent move of essentially constructing a narrative around how that kind of response is fundamentally incongruent with liberal democracy, and how it is essentially a kind of crime or an offense, or it's unlawful. Like trying to engage in political debate in such a fundamentally authoritarian way, essentially. And also essentially link this to the general failure of government, because how can government be responsive if the political debate is essentially being confined and contorted and contrived by this kind of juvenile authoritarian kind of ideological bad faith, that essentially that their ideology can't be properly disagreed with because they're willing to actually back it up with threats of violence or something like that. And then obviously that they will always link their threats of violence to some kind of concept of essentially that if they don't get away with controlling the narrative, that you are actually permitting or promoting some kind of systemic violence against them or something like that. So they'll say, oh, no, we are threatening violence because essentially your political disagreement with us is essentially what they semantically label as violence or something like that. So they have this idea that whatever violence they threaten is defensive, and essentially you just have to be very clear about underlining that hypocrisy and not giving way into their specious interpretation. You really have to not concede to their interpretation. You really have to completely deny the reasonableness of their ideological reinterpretation of reality. Yes, there is some rationalization that they can use, but it's not reasonable. It's not consistent with liberal democracy. It's not consistent with even common sense as well. It sort of, if you really buy into that, then you've already conceded the political argument. You've already conceded essentially democracy. So you don't just get to sort of, because your feelings are more important, you get to make the threats when your feelings feel like that they're on the line, and then you get to control the narrative because you've said that your feelings are on the line and that you've labeled things as being systemic violence or systemic oppression, and so you get to try to control the narrative. No. You don't get to threaten violence in public discourse like that. And so you really have to be willing to escalate things towards that kind of precipice, towards that. Obviously, to try to sort of choose the issue to do it around where you can have the resources essentially to make the requisite parallels as to how their argument is an oversimplification, it's an over-rationalization, it's completely based on a kind of ostrich in the sand kind of selective reality. And you really have to go after their character. I mean, this doesn't work unless you morally indict them. And in some sense, I mean, that's how the whole fascistic worldview functions, is that it kind of hopes that you won't sort of attack them on a personal level, on the level of their integrity, so that then they can be as intellectually dishonest as they so wish. They can just pretend like they can't understand that there's an alternative interpretation to reality. They can just pretend as if their ideological narrative is, is the unitary, unilateral, one and only objective claim that could be made by any, they don't know how to contend with any alternative, and they don't know how to substantiate their position in contradistinction to an alternative. And that's also their sole point, is that, you can also just ask them basic questions. You can, ask basically, well, how do you deal with this factor in terms of substantiating this claim that you make? So you're making this claim, but then how does that claim line up with this basic common sense aspect of reality? And you just ask about, well, substantiate this claim in the light of something basic. And then, they'll say something ideological. They'll say something that conflates history with the future, with the present, that the means will be justified by the ends, or something like that. And, the kind of way that they have to chop reality up into sort of fungible, interchangeable, kind of mix and match sort of games, in order to kind of create an emotional narrative that kind of makes sense in some kind of weirdly relativistic and timeless, kind of objectification and conflation of everything together, is, they have to break so many principles, when they do this kind of narrative witchcraft. And you can train yourself to basically prepare a list of basic sort of principles and contentions, essentially, as to, if they take the bait, I guess, and if they try to answer the questions, and, because you can imagine that what they say will often not even relate to the question at all. It just, they'll answer another question than the question that you actually asked, or the challenge that you put to them, the ideological challenge that you put to them. That they will answer a different challenge that you didn't ask. And then they will try to say, oh, you see, you didn't even ask about this other thing, which is more important, or something like that. And then, you need to, at that point, trot out a basic principle that you can just kind of repeat ad nauseum, which is essentially the thing that points out how their story doesn't line up, that what they're doing doesn't add up, essentially. It's a kind of magic trick. It's a kind of diversion. And, that is you have to create some kind of general theme like that keeps on being repeated, in terms of actually indicting them that they are creating some kind of misinformation, that they are generally weaving a kind of tapestry of subversion and dishonesty, and a kind of narrative inception, essentially, but that they can't handle reality, and that they can't handle the truth. And, sort of just repeating some basic principle that you need to work out a few different sort of summaries, essentially, of how, and it's not that hard to do, but it's also not that easy, because you need the kind of the intuition to do it. But you need to sort of condense what they're doing into like 3 different steps, and you just need to keep on reflecting that back to them to show a kind of accountability, that their narrative witchcraft, that their ideological spell casting is essentially, that you're analyzing it for the tricks that it is, and you keep on sort of showing them that because they use these tricks, they are not living up to certain principles, and that they are breaking certain principles. And then how do you just keep on, well, how do you substantiate or account for this principle? And then, they'll just say, oh, we're going for a higher principle. We're going for the principle of justice, of basic justice. So, and then you have to sort of create perhaps some substantiation yourself as to how, or you say that you're doing this in the name of justice, but your process of doing it is fundamentally a kind of, the means are justified by the ends. And then how do you know that in going for the means are justified by the ends, that your means isn't in fact doing other things, that it isn't in fact enriching politically connected people, that it isn't doing whatever it's doing with impunity and with no proper accountability, because you can always just blame that when you don't get the consequences or you don't get the outcome that you were looking for, that it was because of sabotage, because of the systemic oppression, which you can always just use to scapegoat and divert pressure. Your policy has been tried, and the excuse that the policy wasn't radical enough, I guess it's an interesting gamble. It's an interesting proposition, on in some hypothetical perhaps sense, but like if you look at it in the context of scandal and corruption scandals that never end, that why does your ideology always have deep ties to patronage and corruption? Yeah, I mean, some kind of ideological decomposition of what they are doing, but also why, sort of it's so unreasonable that then they have to sort of concoct this scapegoat and this boogeyman. And this disgusting racial toxic politics, because they can't actually complain on actual issues. They just have to kind of make these morality plays. Okay, this is going to be a commentary on an Intelligence Squared discussion between Yanis Varoufakis. I can't pronounce names, especially not a Greek name. Oh man, I've done this correctly once before, maybe. Varoufakis and Gillian Tett. I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly. Anyway, the title of the discussion or conversation is "Can we fix capitalism?" And yeah, so I guess this maybe requires someone to have listened to this exchange first, but Yanis Varoufakis has made good points, I guess, about the general state of things. I mean, I think I've independently come to the same conclusion that we are facing in a liberal beast, and what he describes quite succinctly as a kind of techno-feudalism, where platforms are essentially displacing functioning markets. That when you enter Amazon, you're entered into you've left the market behind, and now you're a techno peasant, and essentially you're in a post-market, a post-capitalistic sort of form of relating to things. And in some sense, and also I think he quite masterfully says that because of central banking and central bank money being used to prop up the whole system, you've kind of broken the profit incentive, because now the big players just actually eat capitalism, because they buy from the real economy isn't doing well, but people with the fake money that get to essentially get given money for for no cost, then get to buy back their shares from the equity markets, and they buy back the real economy that is actually retaining debt. And so they have a kind of artificial profitability, which is propped up with essentially phony money. And that the system is so addicted to that, I don't know if that's part of essentially the quantitative easing and all that sort of thing, that that real capitalism is essentially, it's on the way out. Now, I think Gillian Tett is brilliant at actually showing the moral deficit in the current system and how the current system essentially falls short of definitionally operating like capitalism. So in some sense, they both agree that capitalism is on the I can't think of a good enough metaphor. Is on the ropes. It's being beleaguered, and slowly, it's dying by a kind of attrition. And and in some sense, I think Gillian Tett has the exact kind of general solution to this, which is, obviously we need mixed solutions to a lot of things, and we need regulation. We need to cut out monopolies and platforms that essentially have a kind of virtual integration. I mean, I'm much more optimistic about this because, I've heard lots of stories about how Amazon, for instance, what makes Amazon good is essentially its distribution chain. Its delivery arm is what makes Amazon agile, and its delivery arm is not owned by itself. It is essentially performed by independent courier companies that essentially will do so under the brand of Amazon, but they are independent operators. And they are actually Amazon takes a lot out of them. I've heard that they have a lot of unfavorable business practices against these delivery people. So in my view, in my mind, I'm thinking there's nothing stopping somebody else from making a separate Amazon. There's no one stopping. If you want to be a supplier, if you want to sell your wares, if you want to sell your product, you could just band together with other people who want to create a digital platform, but obviously one that is not there to essentially siphon data and then feed Amazon, what things it should be, because Amazon essentially makes a lot of its money from its house brand, from its own, it understands the trends and it works out what it should try to produce from China under its own brand, and then it just undercuts the market essentially. In terms of its search function. So it's undercutting the market, as it were, and it also is taking a kind of commission or a cut. Whereas, platforms by their very nature, in some sense, the only thing that Amazon is capable of retaining its dominance is something like an economy of scale in terms of its distribution chain. But which it doesn't own. Its distribution chain does not sort of belong to it, in terms of at least the delivery arm, only in terms of its warehouses and things like that. But obviously it's going to have some economies of scale in terms of the warehouses. But if there was just an alternative platform, which I don't see that there should be something, if someone would just make an alternative platform where essentially the people selling product would essentially pay to service the platform itself, and just a kind of listing fee or something like that. I guess its biggest thing is essentially warehouse stock, I guess. So you would have to sort of have that integrated within the model essentially. But anyway, a more sort of democratically structured Amazon, I don't see why a more democratically structured form of Amazon can't rise up as a competitor to Amazon. Obviously, what you do is, in the beginning, because you have to reach a certain economy of scale in order to be competitive, but obviously you're not going to have the footprint to start off with. So you just do it in one state, or you do it in one city or something like that, and then you kind of, you focus first on large markets, uh, and then so you obviously you can have delivery right at the footstep, right at the doorstep of a large market, and then you kind of spread like that essentially. But anyway, so I mean, I don't see why. I think platforms are especially weak to being competed against, or at least being. I mean, just because no one has done it in some sense, um, I think doesn't detract from the fact that it's actually quite easy to do it. I don't think it's that difficult. We haven't reached yet the kind of the techno feudalism where if you try to create, I mean, I guess you can see beginnings of this, where like Gab, or I can't remember the other independent platforms, how essentially Amazon used its server because Amazon rents out servers to technological companies, and essentially they sort of they they banned Gab because they didn't like the morality of Gab, or they didn't like the free speech of Gab, and they kind of used a kind of culture war sort of umbrella, or aegis to cover the fact that they were essentially crushing their competition. Um, and I'll point out that how identity politics reinforces this kind of techno-feudalism, and because essentially it shares the currency of virtue signaling, it is very easy, therefore, to kind of to indulge in double standards and hypocrisy, and all manner of moral corruption and illiberalism. Now, I think Yanis Varoufakis makes, I think, overreaching arguments where essentially, in some sense, it's very easy to say, well, I'm unconvinced that the thing can be salvaged, so we just need to make something completely new from nothing. And he says that in a very kind of dismissive way, while he says, this monster that we're up against is an illiberal monster, and I can certainly agree with that. But he doesn't actually, I don't think he's trying to fight the good fight, which is essentially to say that people that live in Western-style democracies, that they have a democratic vote with a educated electorate. Essentially, governments would have all the power. You would be able to clean up all these sorts of things if you would just be able to channel democratic power into fighting this. But essentially, the problem is that people themselves have largely been corrupted by identity politics to some degree or another, and they're not willing to have these moral fights because they are occluded, they are disguised within the myriad of sort of finance and all these big players and all these sorts of things, and people are very happy to have their general dismissal of the entire system. Oh, just throw away the whole thing, and we need something completely different, because essentially they're not willing to actually stand up for liberal principles. And there is no excuse why democracy can't essentially. I mean, you really have to blame the people for the state of how they are being taken advantage of. Is essentially the only thing that you obviously Yanis Varoufakis just says no. These people, these techno feudal lords, are so good at controlling the narrative and controlling people's consciousness. I mean, in some sense, I think that his position is slightly incredible, because he says that these people are so powerful that they wouldn't let us regulate them, they wouldn't let us sort of fix things, but they wouldn't be able to resist a complete revolution of the entire system. Because it's an all or nothing kind of proposition that well, if we were to completely dispose of them, we have the power to do that, but we don't have the power to actually make a sophisticated moral stand against them. We only have sort of the power to go back to the drawing board and completely make a new blueprint. And I think that tendency, I believe, on a kind of psychological level, is representative of essentially people's vanity, people's so I was going to make a slightly different point, but essentially people's resistance to a kind of proper democratic accountability. And you can see the kind of, I haven't read Yanis's book, but from what I gleaned from it in terms of this exchange, it seems to me that what he means by sort of bringing democracy into markets, I don't like that, because that's a form of democracy that is very antithetical to real responsibility and accountability. It's the idea that essentially you will always be a kind of a small fish in a large pond, and if if you're going, you will have to get a kind of mandate of at least 50% plus one in terms of all of these democratic structures that operate. And so we'll boil in the vat of essentially the lowest common denominator, or at least the plurality, whatever view garners at least a plurality will kind of be the biggest fish in the pond, and you will just have to be counted in terms of that. And I think that kind of democratization of markets is not going to, I think Gillian Tett, sort of almost diagnosed this, or already kind of complained about, just how fractious this kind of, she called it committee-based, and Yanis resisted. He said, no, this has got nothing to do with about a committee. And in some sense, the fact that it's not going to be a committee, that it's just going to be sort of voting all the time, I think is in some sense, that it's not going to be a committee makes it worse, not better, in some sense. But even a committee itself would also be, at least in a committee, you can sort of put people to reason, and you can sort of try to say, well, why can't we come up with a consensus? Someone must have a convincing argument, and we should at least be able to pragmatically compromise into some kind of consensus. At least you can hope to do that within a committee. Within a vote, you can just have this kind of unaccountable reticence and vanity. And in some sense, it's that kind of reticence which Yanis's model, I think, exemplifies, which is reflected in his refusal to actually make a more sophisticated stand. And Gillian also makes, I think, the perfect sort of argument that she says, well, okay, well, if you want to have a market kind of socialist system, then why don't you just have what you envision? Why don't you just have your model of cooperative? Then you try operate that within the capitalist framework, which we still have to fix anyway, or we still have to save anyway from this kind of illiberal onslaught and a kind of also techno feudal lords. So let me think. There was something else that Yanis did that I thought was essentially a bit overreaching. You see, this is the sort of the tendency within the kind of I must add, I really didn't appreciate Yanis's sort of token kneeling before the Black Lives Matter identitarian sort of complaint, and he just kind of sidestepped it by sort of sentimentally conceding to it, and not seeing it as another apparition of this liberal component of ideology in the current times. But I guess if you're on the left, you kind of there's a kind of compulsory concession that one has to make, because essentially that is the whole project, is to sort of to be a kind of sympathy pulling. You have to create a kind of a general solution, a one-size-fits-all solution that is going to render sympathy to the human condition and going to sort of invest a kind of dignity in this kind of democratic model of essentially all the while the property of accountability just gets kind of lost in the mix. It gets lost in the wash of this sort of general one-size-fits-all solution. I haven't read Yanis's book, but I would like to know the answer to the question is like, what does he actually propose in terms of that essentially it's illegal to have private property, that you can only, if you're involved in a business, for as long as that you are employed by the business or part of the corporation or the corporate body or the company structure, you have this kind of share and a role and a position in the company, and then when you stop being in the company, then you divest from it. Then essentially you give your share back. And I don't know, that basic model. Are you only allowed? Are you only permitted to use that model? You can't use any other model. So in some sense, you have to play. That is the only game on offer in terms of if you want to cooperate with other people, you are compelled to use that particular kind of mechanism. Um, you're not allowed to break that mold. So everyone is forced into this kind of cookie cutter sort of system of a kind of collective accountability. Um, and subordinating themselves to this very sort of one person, one vote in terms of how they contribute their intellectual insight along with their effort, along with their productive work. So you have a kind of productive work, and then everyone gets to be sort of their own um, sort of managerial philosopher or a kind of armchair critic. Um, I guess on some sense you could say, well, if you're going to be shackled by that kind of lowest common denominator sort of consensus building or something like that, I guess you could say that perhaps you're more likely to develop some kind of grassroots trust system where if people, aren't reliable predictors of what is a good plan and what is a bad plan in terms of a business idea, then perhaps they will start trusting people to follow suit or to, sort of, that they will find people that can explain things to them. But, in some sense, I think that this loss of accountability or this loss of having a kind of trust that has real integrity behind it, but behind the decision-making process, is already what we're suffering from collectively in terms of just the abandonment of liberal principles within politics and having proper political representation for liberal principles, and instead we just have a vanguard of people representing illiberal ideology and illiberal principles of essentially double standards, hypocrisy, and virtue signaling. I think that it's ironic because in some sense, you can almost believe in what Yanis Varoufakis is, even in his solution, but as a metaphor, that his diagnosis of the problem and his diagnosis of the solution are both completely viable metaphors, but he fails to essentially see how he is perhaps entracted in his own sort of compromised. I see him as being slightly compromised on the level of this kind of liberal ideology. Anyway, and I think Gillian Tett essentially, although she doesn't maybe explicitly make these points, I think she kind of tentatively opens the door to that kind of criticism in terms of the exchange, showing. But it's very. It's always disheartening when you hear a lot of people talking from the crowd, especially these young people, and they just parrot essentially the same narrative talking point which they get fed from the mainstream media or the legacy media, which is essentially inequality. We need a new system, like it's immoral or something like some kind of virtue signaling, kind of complaint about that there isn't a kind of cosmic morality woven into the system, which has this kind of propensity to completely discard or disregard liberal morality. So it's interesting that, Yanis Varoufakis brings up, that we're dealing with an illiberal monster, but I see very little well, anyway, I've made my point. There's no point in repeating myself. So let me just think if there's anything I can say about Gillian. I mean, I liked all the points that she brought up. I think that that's sort of exactly what needs to kind of happen. I mean, Yanis Varoufakis did at the very start say something which is that we do need to come up with some kind of collective solution as to how we're going to deal with this. But Yanis Varoufakis then goes on to basically say it's a sinking boat. Let's try to create a life raft. Let's try to create an alternative, a major alternative, as essentially the collective solution to the problem. Whereas I think his energy, his political energy also would be much better served to work on some, in his view, a compromise of his own utopic gold standard, or his ideal target, his ideal aim. If he would compromise on that and try to incrementally at least exhaust the general solutions. I mean, what more? I mean, I think that if you are, let's say, an authentic Marxist, or a kind of what I consider to be an orthodox Marxist, not what is actually referred to as orthodox, because orthodox essentially means Leninist. I don't know where they get this word from. But in terms of, I think if you want to prove that capitalism is gone, is not capable of making a comeback, the how you convincingly show people that is you actually, in good faith, you do everything you can to salvage it, and you do everything you can to resurrect it and to redeem it, and then when you fail, then you've got your full evidence that now there must be an alternative. And in some sense, the things that you were trying to save and how you were trying to save it, in some sense, shouldn't that at least be the ingredient to the alternative, or as essentially a stepping stone towards towards creating enough consciousness that will create a safe enough, So, I mean, it's interesting because all these socialistic people, I find how far they fall of the kind of what I would call the intellectual core of, if there is, let's say, the fertile, or whatever, the intellectual impetus and the actual intelligence that lies within the Marxist analysis, that these people have all lost that spark, as far as I can see, that they have all already kind of ideologically compromised. In some sense, is always this lazy Leninist kind of shortcut. Well, history is on our side anyway, so let's just do whatever we want to in the ideological interim. Why not just authentically work the actual Marxist idea, which is actually to make capitalism great, to make capitalism as great as it can be, to make it as good as it can be, to optimize capitalism so that it can organically actually die when it deserves to die. But I mean, I guess perhaps I'm slightly strawmanning Yanis's thesis, which is that these problems are endemic to capitalism, and capitalism has already precipitated its own sort of displacement with feudalism. I think that this analysis is slightly ideologically too convenient and too lazy, because, and I perhaps haven't phrased it perfectly, but this is what I mean, is that the kind of techno-feudalism is ideologically labeled a feudalism, and is ideologically labeled as essentially being the demise of capitalism. But I mean, let's just say that Yanis's idea of having a market with these sorts of things in it, with these shareholder units, library cards in them. Why does he think that we can't regulate capitalism back into a healthy state? Because the whole thing is just basically too top-heavy and controlled by these tyrannical forces and these tyrannical illiberal forces. That's off the table. But what is on the table is just a general revolution, and then the instantiation of essentially no private property and library card shareholdings for everyone. With markets and competition, and essentially profits that doesn't chase after capital, but profits that profit that doesn't remunerate capital, but profits that remunerates these library card shareholdings. Which to me is very strange, because I mean, in some sense, that means that you're going to be democratically tethered to your co-workers to have a kind of a trust that these co-workers are going to properly agree with your evaluation of the management and directorship of an enterprise. So instead of just having someone who is particularly driven or particularly brilliant sort of creating a business model and running it, they have to sort of be indentured to the democratic managerial library card holding co-working cohort. Now, I mean, I guess if you're working in a big factory, or you're working in a kind of big soulless corporation or something like that, and you're not treated well or something like that, and there's a kind of you're just a kind of cog in the machine. I think the kind of vision that Yanis is trying to model to people is, like, let's say, is obviously a general upgrade and a general solution to sort of being a worker in Amazon or something like that. But the idea that it even works on even a kind of small scale is kind of ludicrous. What about like a 5-person business or a 3-person business? I mean, and everyone suddenly just has an equal democratic mandate over. I mean, and then if you deal with the turnover of employees or I guess you have to call them co-workers, because they're also kind of co-owners. So all these sorts of it is conflating moral problems with practical, pragmatic decision-making things. It's kind of homogenizing everything, that essentially now you don't have to worry about who you vote for, because essentially you get a stronger vote in a more local and direct kind of democratic way, because essentially you are much more powerful. I mean, I guess the only thing that tempers that is competition. Is that if within a particular company they're going to be outcompeted by other, which is just, to me, makes it even more unfair on some level, because that means that you have to have a successful business model, otherwise you're going to go out of business, because you're just going to be outcompeted. So you can't, so everyone is basically part of the managerial directorship of the corporation or of the company. And that means that if you get a whole lot of new workers, which all have this different sentiment about how the direction of the company should go, and they run the company into the ground, then you are anchored to the sinking ship, as it were, as you get outcompeted by these bad ideas. Also, you have the problem of essentially ideological warfare between companies as well, which, in some sense, well, I guess in some sense you could create common standards much more easily, because in this way, unionization across companies for basic standards and basic costs. Man, you'd really have to make things transparent, because if you could sort of, in some sense, if you could sort of peg a minimum wage in your society, and then you could kind of within a particular company, as a business decision, you agree that you actually pay slightly under that minimum wage, but you have like very favorable working conditions or something like that, that you try to maximize something, but you just basically keep it a secret that everyone is getting a kind of illegal wage that is sort of breaking the industry minimum or something like that. Anyway, I could see that there's a huge propensity for a kind of ideological warfare here, where essentially you could either encourage people in competitor firms or in competitor companies to agitate for policies that make them uncompetitive. For example, campaigning for a higher minimum wage, and then sort of just getting everyone to, in your company, to misreport how many hours they actually work, so that they sort of, so that you get a kind of competitive edge over your competitors, and so you kind of have an economy of scale, and you kind of, anyway. So in some sense, when you kind of localize trust in this kind of democratic market interface, but essentially the democracy is not linked to the industry, but it's only linked to your local company that you are in, that you are the co-worker within, or something like that. Now you've actually got a kind of, anyway. So I think that there are, I'm anticipating that there are different kinds of, let's say, failure modes or failure conditions that end up, you get the same problems of the human condition just manifesting in different forms. So I think Yanis's social market system has the same propensity for, you could call it irregular dysfunction or pathology. It's just going to manifest slightly differently. In fact, it might even manifest much more viciously. At least within the current system, there's nothing stopping people from creating a new, novel, innovative, way of interfacing with things. And certainly with technology, I think that there's no excuse. People have a kind of open source ability to coordinate with one another and to create alternatives. I don't see why there can't be already a kind of, all you would need already to have a kind of, you could have a decentralized, distributed platform like Amazon, where, sort of in the same way that torrents, you can download things from many different people who seed a torrent. You could have many different people that seed this platform in terms of their own computing power and internet access, creating a decentralized, sort of shopping platform. And then all you would need to do is have like something like a delivery service, a courier service, a postal thing that was like, so you were just like a very reliable or cost effective or something kind of delivery structure or something like that. And then you could already kind of go quite far into displacing, if we just bring down the cost of what do they call it, sort of shipping or transit, which, already, there are lots of things that are in the pipeline potentially of fixing a lot of these things, like airships, using airships instead of shipping. Essentially a form of very cheap air freight that is much more decentralized, because obviously when you ship things, you have to dock the shipment at a port, and there's only so many ports and so much port space, and there's so much sort of logistics that can happen around a hub like a port. Whereas with airships, you can land them anywhere. You can land them directly at a warehouse or distribution center that can be sort of inland. And so this puts like a lot less pressure on logistics and sort of freight. So I know I'm really not that worried about the tech oligarchs and feudal lords. um, especially since they don't have the power at the moment to quash all their. They don't actually have the power to completely bar competitors. And so, in as much as that they have a monopoly or an effective monopoly, that is still, in some sense, at the allowance, as it were, of the market. Is essentially allowing itself to be entranced or sort of encapsulated by these tech effective monopolies. But there's nothing intrinsic about these monopolies that make them a kind of a permanent feature or a kind of immovable structure. But anyway, and in some sense, I think that what Yanis fails to do is to actually say that the real trouble here is actually the democratic illiteracy, as it were, and the subversion of democracy, or the subversion of democratic literacy, the subversion of liberal values, which I would argue Yanis is not doing a very good job of proselytizing about. Because for all his bending the knee to identity politics and all of his so in my view, Yanis is a bit of a walking contradiction to some degree, um, in that he's cherry picking, as the left must do, in order to kind of insulate its grifting of a sympathy narrative, of a one size fits all solution. And I think that he is somewhat failing in, because yes, we do live through, we are living through an egregious assault on liberal values. And Yanis is obsessed with his metaphorical solution to this problem, but he is not making as a sophisticated enough defense of liberal values. And in some sense, I think that that would lead him towards exhausting every opportunity to essentially salvage or recover capitalism in some kind of functional state. And I would even argue that if he did so, he would garner more attention, he would garner a bigger platform to generally. And if he tries to solve the problems of capitalism and he fails, then that is the greatest clarion call, that is the greatest siren alert to everyone that there is no salvaging this, essentially. I mean, I don't see why you couldn't necessarily sell to an electorate that, okay, the next time there's going to be a crisis, we're going to let the central bank, sort of, or we're going to, I mean, I guess it depends in what your debt is denominated in. What currency your debt is denominated in, I guess that makes a huge difference. But I guess I don't know enough about economics and finance, I think, to come up with a kind of a general sort of solution. But I mean, I guess, if you have a fiscus which is capable of treading water or having its head above water, and you're capable of essentially engineering or trying to work towards engineering a properly authentic real economy that is actually, that actually is working like capitalism should be working, that you actually have a profit incentive, you actually have a market. Um, anyway, perhaps I'm talking from a different perspective, because sort of being in South Africa, there is just so much undevelopment. There's so much basic things that need to be. There's so much growth that needs to happen, and there's so much growth that could happen, except that sort of we're not going to have any growth until we have the capacity to supply energy to that growth, and we have an electricity grid which is losing capacity, not adding capacity. So it's actually impossible to have economic growth if you don't have an expanding electricity supply, or an expanding capacity of supplying electricity. And so that is certainly, so unless we can kind of decentralize electricity generation to make up for that, some kind of shortfall, in a kind of immediate sense, growth is going to be barred from us. And I do think that you could probably get a lot of power if we just allowed sort of corporations to directly invest into their own generation. That we might start having more and more capacity available. But anyway, this is a complete sort of tangent. But it's just amazing how all sort of pragmatic things have just been completely sidelined, sort of in the face of this kind of illiberal ideological slime and virtue signaling, and essentially the kind of the great disguise. Sorry, there's probably a good metaphor to call it the disguise of. I mean, I do think that at the end of the day, it's the democracy that actually holds the can for this. It's the people themselves. I mean, if we've ever suffered from a self-engineered crisis because of having an unresponsive democracy that essentially is plaguing itself with its own lackadaisical safeguard or guardianship of liberal morality and liberal values, So do people really deserve to live in a comfortable free society when they have essentially repudiated basic liberal morality? And I think that the answer is no, which is why, the famous quote is that people get the government that they deserve. And I think that essentially is always fundamentally true in the long term. People do get the government that they deserve. And essentially, what is happening to us and what is going to continue happening to us essentially is what we deserve. I think this is the greatest sort of secret of our times. And I think anyone who sort of fails to champion that is just sort of another force of essentially, ironically, providing a kind of opium of the masses, a kind of almost this kind of religious thing. Yes, the inequality. Yes, like all, sort of complaining about these things which have no kind of fundamental sort of procedural integrity, in terms of the process of in terms of the structure of how we make society, in some sense, what I see, what Yanis is doing, in some sense, is he's providing another version of this leftist social psychology one-size-fits-all solution, which is like, yes. The problem is that there's something dark within the human condition. Therefore, we have to force each other to play with each other. We have to force each other to share management of business. And why he chooses that as a kind of collective therapy for humanity is, to me, an arbitrary election. It's an arbitrary decision that, economy causes inequality, causes all these bad labels, and so we're going to attack these bad labels by forcing people to essentially respect one another, by giving them an equal voting right with these library cards, so that we can force people to actually agitate one another. We can force people to have to listen to one another. We can force people to have to sort of tap into each other's decision making, and they have to communicate, and there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser in terms of engineering some kind of consensus or some kind of collective decision making. So we're forced to listen to each other. And quite frankly, I don't want to listen to everyone. I don't want to listen to people who I've already explained to them that they have bad ideas and they keep on repeating their same bad ideas. I don't want to live in that kind of society. Yanis, I don't. I don't want to live in that society, Yanis. I want to be able to say, no, no, no. I don't have to tolerate listening to the same bullshit that I've already dispelled convincingly, but you can't let go of. Because essentially you're afraid, I guess, of the mirror of accountability. You would rather essentially have some kind of, I mean, the biggest problem that all of this amounts to is that everyone gets to vote their sentiment. They don't get to vote their reason. They're not forced to vote responsibly. They just get to vote their own sentiment. What happens if I actually am sick and tired of sentiments that are unjust, that are fundamentally insatiable in terms of their propensity for destruction and stupidity or self-indulgence or vanity or something like that? And you just say, well, you have to let me have my vanity or something like that. Yes, in some sense I do, but now you're making me play with you. You're making me take up my library card with my co-workers. No, thank you, Yanis. I can just see where that's a kind of, I don't want to be trolled by people. I would rather have a structure that is slightly more sophisticated and dynamic, where I'm not going to be trolled by some lowest common denominator narrative consensus building that I constantly have to ideologically police. If I build a structure out of my own freedom of association and freedom of contract, and I don't have to use your mechanism. Perhaps I'm strawmanning Yanis's point, because I don't know if he says that this library card thing is a mandatory mechanism or a mandatory structure within his utopia, or if it's just one of the many sort of templates that he has, but you have to choose one of these templates. So I don't really know what his position is, if this is the only template, essentially, or if everything has to be a template that is modeled or a slight modulation of that. Then I do have a huge problem. But in a sense, Gillian already, I think, proposed the solution to this, which is that, okay, well, you can have your market, your social market as a model that exists within the general capitalistic market, and try to outcompete it or something. But anyway. So I think, anyway, I've been very hard on Yanis, but I would like to hear his see, I see this with Noam Chomsky as well, and you can see it egregiously with Noam Chomsky, and it's interesting because as Noam Chomsky has gone into the identity politics realm, it seems Yanis has perhaps followed him. And I think that, I think that this is a cynical concession that they have made, because they know that essentially if they don't go along with it, then they are going to be left behind by the leftist bandwagon, that they kind of have to make some concession to it. Otherwise, essentially, they're going to be, their library card of being a leftist is going to be revoked. Ha ha ha. Oh, what a wonderful symmetry of the point that I've just made. That they have to kind of grovel along with this lowest common denominator consensus narrative that has been built, because otherwise they're going to lose essentially any power that their library card might have within their, sort of their democratic model of building towards some kind of consensus and having to compromise liberal values, which is what I'm seeing them doing. I mean, obviously, okay, you could say that I'm projecting bad faith onto them. I'm speculating that it's a cynical move on their part, because I do think that they're not stupid enough to know that essentially that this stuff isn't very dangerous, that it isn't fundamentally fascistic even, that identity politics is essentially proto-fascism. I think that's very obvious to everyone. Or Noam Chomsky has made these kinds of criticisms, that these are the elements of identity politics that have to be ameliorated. But then he doesn't exactly say how to actually, I mean, he says that essentially should be the new aim within the people within this space, that they have to kind of learn to make a consensus that doesn't essentially trammel other people's liberation fronts, that essentially, how do you try to promote the cause of one without essentially making it a zero-sum sort of power game within society? And there is no way of doing that. Identity politics is antithetical to that kind of win-win situation. It is a fundamentally sort of parasitic, fascistic kind of externalization of blame, and a kind of parasitic extraction of social justice, so-called, while it is in fact, I would argue, the manifestation of social injustice, because it expects people to be sacrificed to the altar of the benefit of the many, which is exactly what the guarantee of social justice bars, is that you cannot essentially treat one person as a sacrificial lamb for everybody else. The definition, you have to treat everyone like an individual. You have to have general laws of application, and the same general principles and the same rights for everyone, with consistent values. And they kind of get away with this because essentially they gerrymander their values. They kind of play a Ponzi scheme with them, or they have a kind of shell game where they sort of put some of the values into the future, and some of the values have been lost in the past, and then they can sort of have this gerrymandering. The means are justified by the ends, and then they can get away with this kind of egregious Orwellian sort of program of control and doublespeak. Anyway, so I think Yanis has kind of falls short of dealing with any of that kind of stuff, as I've said. So has Noam Chomsky, but essentially is because they are trying to perhaps revise what the current sort of state of leftism is, working within the bubble rather than sort of trying to be on the outside. What's the other? So, I mean, I feel like I'm making the kind of the perennial Bakunin-ian critique of leftism, from my kind of psychological, anarchistic, kind of analysis of this, which is almost a kind of a more psychological Marxist analyst of analysis of all this stuff. But sorry, so I've really kind of I've done all these horrible things where I've compared Yanis to Lenin slightly. I've compared him to making all these problems and mistakes. But when I really would just encourage him to stop making metaphors of the solution and to actually start working more proximately on the authentic sort of next step in the Marxist chain, which is proving that capitalism can't work by actually trying to save it properly, by actually trying to recover it and redeem its liberal qualities to it. Because I think that is exactly the kind of, in some sense, that's not even activism. That's in some sense will precipitate the correct kind of conflict, ideological conflict as well, that will be a better platform to developing a better alternative if an alternative is required. But I think that the reason why people don't want to actually engineer towards a real, let's say, recovery of capitalism and of liberal values is because if they kind of criticize the illiberalism, they will end up criticizing the people who are fueling the potential of a general reset or a general revolution in some sense. They'll dampen their own parade in some sense, and they are not willing to fracture their own, in some sense, already delicate menagerie of sympathy extracting, unaccountable psychological I can't think of a word, but essentially sort of the infantilism, um, which is in some sense the kind of the ideological theme that the leftist sort of worldview is essentially has this toxic relationship to both cultivating and profiting from, which also is the same thing that is fueling the illiberalism from the techno oligarchs and feudalists. And so I find it ironic that Yanis essentially does not take up arms against the techno feudalists other than calling them that. But I would even argue that he is part of, let's say, the tolerance of them, because he's just, no, give it up. There's no regulation that can happen against them. So he's not even, he's saying, wouldn't it be nice to regulate them? Or he said that he wanted microtransactions for data, for use of data, or something like that. I mean, Gillian is actually asking for some. I mean, that's quite brilliant, asking for data to be portable. I don't know how serious that is, because allowing people to take their data to a new company and give it to a new company is certainly feasible. But the thing about, I mean, in some sense, that'll be quite interesting because, we, the general public, are told not to copy our data. Or not to copy data that we have available to us that we don't own, but that we possess. We often possess data which we are copyrighted against duplicating, intellectual property rights. It would be interesting if, that is quite an elegant solution. If you essentially create a perpetual intellectual property right of someone to own their own data, and this is an inalienable right. And if you make someone's personal data an inalienable intellectual property right that belongs to them, then essentially they have to rent it out to people who want to use it. And then they can divest it and port it around. But then the question is in terms of how do you police corporations doing that? Because corporations, for instance, might aggregate the data they might confect it into an algorithm essentially. And so just because you're capable of porting your data out of the system, what happens if they've already created a secondary or tertiary data product that already has that data confected into it? Obviously, in terms of intellectual property, you could probably make the case that this is going to be a new sort of thing. But also, I guess it depends on how much that secondary or tertiary intellectual property is a derivative of the data, or if it just used the data as a kind of deep learning sort of ingredient, and in some sense anybody else could have been used just as well, and it maybe would have changed the algorithm, but the algorithm isn't about essentially selling something to your type of person. It's about simply, it's like a meta model. It's working out how to meta interpret. Like the algorithm is essentially a it's a I don't have the jargon, I guess, but essentially, that I imagine that such algorithms or that such secondary or tertiary, sort of intellectual property products that are derivative from personal data would essentially be a kind of a confection of deep learning into saying, okay, well, we have this product which has these sorts of tags or these sorts of properties about it, and we can use this algorithm to tell us the likely propensity of different people to receive it in some kind of, to be sold it, or to be influenced by it. I mean, it might also be an algorithm for a kind of psychological manipulation. That essentially you can know how to kind of ideologically manipulate people, which, I mean, Facebook has explicitly even run these experiments and has even been has even told people that it's run these kind of social experiments. But and I mean, this is because essentially there are some regular patterns in Facebook, as it were, that in people's use of certain things, which I mean, in the same way that if you read a kind of, if you read, oh my word, why can't I never remember things? What is it? The scientific statistics and the manual on what's it called? I can't remember the acronym, but the IDM-5 or whatever the hell it's called. The thing that people make compound diagnoses and diagnostic statistics and something manual for psychiatry, and DSM-5, I think, or whatever DSM. So it's like a DSM, you can essentially pigeonhole people into symptom diagnostic brackets, and you could probably also push people towards manifesting conditions as well, I imagine. Anyway, so you could probably work out secondary and tertiary products using people's portable data to work out strategies of how to identify what people and how people would be particularly prone to being socially engineered, essentially, by controlling their feed, or by editing what people see in their feed, or by promoting certain things within suggestions to them. I mean, I've made this point before. This is a kind of an esoteric point, but essentially, the biggest problem that we have in terms of the tech oligarchs and feudal tech lords is essentially that you can't control the curatorship of what is promoted and given sorry, I can't think of the word that just basically means the focus of your attention, the what is commended to you in terms of. So because you don't see the character of what is curating that, and because you can't essentially choose that, you are no longer is your use of because originally I would say that your use of technology was a more liberally grounded. When I say liberally, I mean that in the sense of a classical liberal individual kind of way, that is grounded within your internal locus of control, that you're at the helm of the ship, you're the captain of the ship, you get to choose what you consume. And in some sense, if you want to find more things to consume, you had to go and seek out forums of discussion to see where people were talking about. So to get suggestions of what to look at, you would have to go and be involved in other things. So you would have to go onto a separate forum, onto a separate website, onto a separate point of contact with other people to learn about what you should be passionate about or what you should find interest in. So you would have to get inspiration from other sources. And you would choose, that would be your own, under your own steam. So you would have to know someone that would suggest to you something. That has all been displaced, essentially, by a kind of hidden curatorship of these things. So anyway, I've made more intelligent points about that, but essentially that means that when you look at the history of your own pattern and use of technology and websites, that used to be a record of your own volition. It used to be essentially you could, because this is the wonderful thing about technology, is it basically extends the scope of your memory. Because, usually when people remember things, they don't aggregate that memory. Whereas technology, you can actually look at your history and you can say, okay, I can actually start to see the pattern of my own interest. I can see the teleological way, what's the consequence of the heading that I'm going in? And so you can you can look through your own history and you can say, okay, I'm interested in that, then I'm interested in this, then I'm interested in that again, then I'm interested in this again. I'm just going through a cycle. I'm just going through a repetitive cycle. And you can actually look back at yourself and you can say, oh, you see, I just do this and it's useless. It ends up nowhere. And now I can make a metacognition about my own set of behavior, as it were. And so you can use it as a tool to self-actualize or at least to introspect. But you can't do that anymore because now you're not introspecting about your own volition, about your own purpose, about your own teleos. You're only capable of surveying how you are being toyed with by whoever is curating what is promoted to your attention. So in some sense, you're being calibrated, you're being primed, as it were, in a very illiberal sort of way. And what's worse is that we can kind of feel lucky when we find when it gives us exactly what we want. But we can also be in a kind of stagnant, sort of never-ending sort of mist, I guess, where you never escape out of something because you're just hoping that something new, bright and spangly will be presented to you within this kind of dark art of just sort of being fed a bread trail crumb and or something, but you don't know the character of the thing that's leaving you these breadcrumbs. And in some sense now, when you look at your history, you're no longer looking at a history of your own volition, you're looking at the history of how you are being toyed with and how you're being sort of captivated. And in some sense, people are now entering into a very toxic relationship to this breadcrumb sort of being toyed with, because in some sense, that is government, that is the illiberal, that is the tech oligarch. I mean, even what I've been talking about, that is the tech feudal overlord, is making life easy for you, and in some sense and you're addicted to that kind of illiberal infantilism. So you're being enculturated to this infantilism, but then you want the infantilism and you want more, and you're like, no, but I expect to be given more zestier, commended things to watch. I have a higher standard. I want to feel like I'm growing. I want to feel dignified in my infantilism. When I'm being infantilized, I want to be told that I'm such a noble and clever person simultaneously. I want to be told that I'm an independent person. I want my infantilism to tell me how radical and revolutionary and sort of and where does accountability go in all of this? It's lost in a kind of ideological paradox. Yanis has asked, is capitalism devouring democracy? I would say that it's the democracy that has devoured capitalism. And it's done so because of its moral incredulity about its own susceptibility to moral defects in some sense. People have sort of had their vanity indulged in so much, and especially when you have this kind of tech overlord, oligarch, this tech feudal overlord that is kind of your helpful big brother that's there to infantilize you and there to make you feel good about yourself, and there to give you some virtue signaling about your identity politics and to give you some outlet for your identity politics. I mean, this is, in some sense, people deserve this. If people fall for this, they deserve it. They really do. But the people who don't fall for this, I think that they need to kind of jailbreak themselves and leave those who don't want to jailbreak themselves. They should leave them behind because that's what they deserve, is my general point. And I just think that's a point that I don't see Yanis making, and I don't imagine that he can make it within his kind of leftist compromise that I see him on the trail thereof. But all I can encourage him is to sort of jump the bandwagon and to be more contrarian. But see, it is hard for people on the left, perhaps to some degree. But I think that essentially let's say the social market is going to be much more dynamic and much more open source and much more less, let's say, overlorded by some kind of governmental structure than perhaps Yanis is perhaps imagining in his book, although again, I haven't read his book. But anyway, I think a lot of what I say probably is applicable to what he has contributed. Anyway, let me stop this recording.